Christmas had always been my season, not just because of the music or the lights, but because it was the one time of year when the house felt full of warmth, laughter, and the kind of love you can't buy. For decades, I poured myself into the holidays. I cooked enough to feed an army. I decorated every corner of the house, from mistletoe over the doorways to cinnamon candles in the kitchen. I saved up for gifts months in advance, always picking out something thoughtful, even when times were tight. I used to think that if I made the season magical enough, it would be remembered, held onto, passed down. But this year, something was different. December crept in quieter than usual. No phone calls, no shopping list for my daughter, no excited messages from my son asking if he could bring his friends over. Just silence. Still, I waited. Hope is a stubborn thing. I imagined it would come late, maybe a last-minute plan, like they often did. I told myself they were just busy, that the invitation would arrive any day now. I cleaned the guest rooms, baked a few early cookies, and even ironed the tablecloth. I wanted to be ready. Then one evening, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call, just a short text. We just want a peaceful Christmas with the friends. Don't come. For a long moment, I didn't move. My thumb hovered over the screen as I stared at those words. They weren't even cruel, just detached, like I was an obligation that no longer fit the theme of their new lives. Not family, just noise. My heart didn't break all at once. It cracked, slow, quiet, and final. I sat back, closed my eyes, and let the silence answer for me. Then I typed one word. Enjoy. No exclamation, no question, just that. And in that single word reply, I released something I hadn't realized I was holding on to. The version of Christmas I had carried in my heart for years was gone. But maybe, just maybe, something else was about to take its place. I can still remember the Christmas when my daughter was 7 and asked for a dollhouse. Not just any dollhouse, but the one with lights and a working elevator. It was expensive, far beyond what I could afford that year. But I said, we'll see, and quietly started skipping my morning tea. I packed sandwiches for work instead of buying lunch. I sold an old bracelet I hadn't worn in years. Little by little, I saved. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the dollhouse was hidden in the coat closet, wrapped in shiny red paper with gold ribbon. That night, after the kids went to bed, I stayed up until 3 a.m., assembling it piece by piece with shaking hands. My back ached, but my heart was full. The look on her face the next morning, wide eyes, the kind of joy that makes time stop, made every sacrifice feel like magic. That was just one year. There were so many. The year my son caught the flu right before Christmas and couldn't stop coughing. I stayed awake 3 nights straight by his side, sponge bathing his forehead and spooning warm soup into his mouth. I never made it to the family dinner. I never once thought of complaining. Then there was the year we had nothing. I mean, truly nothing. I had lost my job in November, and all I could afford was flour, sugar, and some oranges. So I baked cinnamon bread, tied it in paper with string, and wrote little notes for each of them. Thank you for making this year beautiful, even when it wasn't easy. They didn't notice the absence of big gifts. They only saw the love. I stayed up countless nights wrapping presents in secret, sewing costumes for the church play, fixing broken ornaments. I was Santa. I was the cook, the cleaner, the hug, the laughter, the keeper of joy. I gave them Christmas not just with money, but with memory. And now, they send a message. A line of text. Detached. Casual. We just want a peaceful Christmas with the friends. Don't come. That's what I get after decades of twinkling lights, cinnamon-scented hugs, and tired hands that never stopped giving. I gave my heart on every Christmas platter, and they sent me a text. There was a time when my daughter couldn't fall asleep without her small hand curled into mine. When my son would burst into the kitchen just to tell me about a new joke he'd heard. Our house used to echo with laughter, the kind that came from living in the moment, not checking a calendar. They used to fight over who got to help me frost the cookies. They made cards out of construction paper and taped them on the fridge like masterpieces. There was no sense of obligation, only joy, only presence. And me, I lived for that. But slowly, something shifted. I don't remember the exact moment. It's never just one day, is it? It happens like shadows stretching across a sunny afternoon, subtle, creeping, unnoticed until suddenly, you're in the dark. After they married, the distance grew. Not just physically, but emotionally. I told myself it was normal. New responsibilities, building new homes, new dynamics. But holidays changed. Phone calls shortened. Conversations felt more like updates than moments. And it wasn't what they said. It was how they didn't say anything at all. No more, "What are you making for dinner, Ma?" Just, "We're already eating at Lauren's parents' place." No more, "Can we come over early and help set up?" Just, "We might be running late. We'll see." There weren't any fights. No dramatic falling outs. They weren't cruel. Just cold. They smiled politely when they visited, brought gifts that felt obligatory, stayed for only the necessary hours before checking their watches or glancing at the door. I'd ask how they were, and they'd say, "Busy." I'd ask if they needed anything, and they'd say, "We're good." And so, slowly, I stopped asking. I became part of the furniture, something they stepped around. A relic of their childhood that didn't quite fit their grown-up living rooms. Not a person, just clutter. I don't know when they stopped seeing me as family, but I know when I started feeling like a stranger. It was the day my voice felt like background noise. The day my stories got interrupted. The day they stopped hugging me at the door and started checking their phones instead. It hurts more than anger ever could, because when someone's angry, at least they still care. But when they become indifferent, that's when love slips through your fingers like sand, and all you can do is sit in the silence and wonder if they ever really saw you at all. It was Christmas Eve when I finally opened my phone again. I hadn't intended to. Something in me was trying to protect what little peace I had left. But curiosity, or maybe old habit, led me to their social media pages. And there it was. Photo after photo. The house was glowing. Twinkling lights wrapped around banisters I once dusted with care. A massive tree stood in the corner, the one I helped them pick out 3 years ago when they moved in. The fireplace mantel was lined with stockings, wine glasses in every hand. People huddled together in sequined joy. Their smiles were real, but I wasn't in a single frame. Friends I had never met filled the living room. Co-workers, I assumed, by the matching sweaters and inside jokes in the captions. A few distant in-laws, people they barely knew, sat comfortably on the couch I once sat on during birthdays and baby showers. And then, just under a group photo, I saw it. Finally, a peaceful Christmas. The words hit me harder than their text, because now I understood. It wasn't peace they wanted. It was my absence. I wasn't part of the chaos. I wasn't a source of conflict. I didn't make demands or cause scenes. I cooked, cleaned, showed up with thoughtful gifts, and tried, always tried, to keep the traditions alive. But maybe that was the problem. I reminded them of where they came from, of small apartments and hand-sewn stockings, of Christmas mornings without fancy gifts, just shared moments and warm food. Maybe I didn't fit in their curated version of life anymore, the version where things were shiny and quiet and aesthetically filtered. I wasn't polished enough for their pictures. I didn't match the decor, and so they deleted me, not with hate, with erasure, as if I had never been the one who made their holidays magical to begin with. I closed the app and put the phone face down on the table. In that moment, I realized something cold and freeing. I wasn't grieving the party. I was grieving the lie, the belief that I was still part of their circle, their world, their hearts. But I wasn't. And maybe it was time to stop reaching for a door they had already locked from the inside. The gifts were already waiting in the closet before the text arrived. Each one had been chosen with care, not expensive, but meaningful. A framed childhood photo for my daughter, printed on soft linen paper. A set of handcrafted spice jars for my son, because he once said he wanted to start cooking more. Even a delicate book of poems for my daughter-in-law, marked with my favorite passages and quiet blessings. I had picked them over time, not all at once. That's what people like me do. We don't wait for December. We listen in March, notice in June, and prepare in silence. So when they sent the message, "We just want a peaceful Christmas with the friends," don't come. I didn't cry over the text. I cried because the gifts were already wrapped in my heart. But I wrapped them anyway. One by one, I smoothed the paper over corners and folded edges with trembling fingers. I tied ribbons. I tucked small notes inside each one, still signed with love, always. Then I placed them gently on the table, stood back, and took a photo. Not for them, for me. Proof that I tried, that I didn't let their coldness harden my warmth. And then, with a calm I didn't expect, I picked up an empty cardboard box, lined it with tissue paper, and began placing the gifts inside. Each one found its place. I labeled the box donate, not because I stopped loving them, but because someone else, somewhere, might feel the thoughtfulness I once reserved only for them. I didn't want them to feel forgotten. I just wanted to feel remembered. There's a quiet grief in letting go of gifts meant for people who don't show up. But there's also dignity in not begging them to notice. That year, children I didn't know opened my presents. And while they didn't know who I was, I knew one thing for certain. At least someone smiled. And that smile, even from a stranger, meant more than silence ever could. Christmas Eve came with a stillness I hadn't known in years. No sound of footsteps rushing up the stairs. No last-minute gift wrapping. No pots bubbling on the stove or the hum of laughter from the living room. Just silence, not heavy, not angry, just present. I boiled water and made myself a cup of tea. Chamomile, the one I used to make for them when they were too excited to sleep on Christmas Eve. I turned on the old stereo and let a soft instrumental carol play in the background. Then I lit a small candle and placed it in the center of the table, letting its golden glow reflect off the quiet. Dinner was simple, a warm bowl of lentils, rice, and a few roasted vegetables. I arranged it on the table as if someone else might join me. Old habits, I suppose. Even in solitude, I couldn't unlearn hospitality. Outside, from far across the neighborhood, I heard the faint pop of fireworks. I imagined their street, lit up, loud, joyful. Their friends clinking glasses, their children opening gifts I didn't wrap. The living room overflowing with music and curated holiday cheer. And yet, I didn't cry, because the loneliness wasn't new. It had simply removed its mask this time. It used to hide behind quick hugs and distracted conversations. Behind "we'll visit soon and maybe next time." But now, it stood before me honestly, without disguise. And somehow, that truth was easier to sit with than the years of pretending everything was okay. I looked around my quiet home and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. They took me out of Christmas, but I took the pain out of it, too. Because in this stillness, there were no expectations. No forced smiles. No feeling like I was an afterthought in a room I helped build. Just peace. Real peace. Not the kind you claim in a text to justify exclusion, but the kind that arrives when you no longer beg to be included. I sipped my tea, leaned back in my chair, and listened, not to what was missing, but to what remained. And in that silence, I found myself again. Just as I was rinsing my teacup and blowing out the candle, a gentle knock tapped at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Certainly not tonight. I opened the door slowly, unsure, and there she was. Myra, my neighbor's teenage granddaughter. She stood bundled in a red scarf and mittens, holding a small box wrapped in foil and tied with a crooked bow. "Hi," she said, a little shy. "Grandma made too many cookies. She said you might be lonely tonight." For a moment, I couldn't speak. That single sentence, simple, sincere, filled more space in my heart than any text my children had sent all year. "Come in," I said softly. "It's cold." She stepped inside, wiping her boots on the mat. I made her a cup of hot cocoa, and we sat in the living room. I offered her the comfiest blanket. She offered me stories about school, her dog, how she hates algebra but loves writing poetry. Her eyes lit up when she spoke, and she didn't look at her phone once. She asked me questions, real ones, about my favorite Christmas memory, about the ornaments on my tree, about what I used to do when I was her age. And when I told her about my daughter's dollhouse, or my son's obsession with candy canes, she didn't smile politely and move on. She leaned in. She listened. She laughed in all the right places. She cared. For the first time in years, I felt like my words weren't floating into a void. They landed. They mattered. We sat for over an hour, talking about everything and nothing. When it was time for her to go, she hugged me tightly, the kind of hug that says, "You're not invisible." "I'm really glad I came," she whispered. And I was too. After she left, I sat alone again, but it felt different now. The silence wasn't as sharp, because in that moment, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel unwanted. I felt seen. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures or the people you expect who remind you that you still matter. Sometimes, it's a teenage girl with cookies and a warm heart who walks into your life quietly and leaves a light behind. The next morning, I woke with a strange calm in my chest, like something had settled after a long storm. The house was still quiet, but not in a lonely way. It was the kind of quiet that gives you space to think, to feel, to finally exhale. I sat at my desk by the window, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began to write. Not a list, not a journal entry, a letter. To them, to my children. Not because I wanted to guilt them, not because I needed a reply, but because there were things I needed to say, for myself. Words that had lived inside my chest like stones. I began slowly, the pen trembling just a little at first. "Dear ones," I wrote, "I hope Christmas was everything you wished it to be. Peaceful, joyful, full of warmth. I stayed home, as you asked. I hope my absence gave you what my presence could not." I paused, let the words settle, then continued. "This is not a letter of blame. I'm not angry. I'm simply tired. Tired of begging for a seat at a table I built with my own hands. Tired of waiting to be remembered by people I never once forgot. Tired of shrinking myself into silence just so you could feel less crowded." My eyes welled up, but I kept writing. "You didn't need to include me. That was your choice. But now, I make mine. I will no longer show up where I'm not wanted. I will no longer offer love that is met with indifference. I will no longer pretend your absence doesn't hurt." The final lines came softer than I expected. "But still, I love you. I always will. From a distance. Without expectation." I signed it simply, "Mom." I sat with the letter for a long while. Then I folded it gently, pressed it flat, and placed it in the drawer beneath my scarves, right next to an old photo of us laughing on a Christmas morning long ago. Will I ever send it? I don't know. Maybe it's not meant for their eyes. Maybe it was always meant for mine. But it's written now. And that, somehow, was enough. A week slipped by, quietly. Christmas came and went. So did the messages from distant cousins, the forwarded gifts in family group chats, and even a single Happy New Year text from my son. Cold, casual, like we hadn't just passed through the loneliest holiday I'd ever known. And then, it was January 1st. There was no grand celebration, no midnight toast or confetti. Just a gentle sunrise through my window and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my slippers as I walked toward the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. It was time. I pulled open the dusty door and climbed the steps slowly. The air was still and musty, full of things I once held dear. Baby clothes, school projects, a box labeled Christmas traditions. Inside were ornaments my children once made with glitter and glue. Cards they wrote in crayon. A red stocking with my name in shaky letters. Mommy. I sat for a long while, holding those pieces of the past like relics. And then, for the first time, I didn't cry. I smiled. Because those moments were real, even if the people in them had changed. I began sorting through everything. Not just the items, but the emotions. The hopes I had held on to far too long. The belief that one day they'd come home and things would feel whole again. I realized I'd been carrying those expectations like boxes filled with breakable things. So I boxed them up, too. Not to throw away, but to finally put down. I kept the good memories, but I let go of the need for them to repeat. I whispered to myself as I taped up the last box. This year, I won't chase. I won't explain. I'll simply live. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. I would live in the present, with people who wanted me there. In places that felt warm, in moments that felt honest. I descended the attic stairs lighter, not just in body, but in heart. The new year didn't promise magic. but it offered something better: a clean slate, a quiet room, and the choice to fill it with peace, not pain. I opened the windows, let in the cold morning air, and breathed deeply. This was my beginning. Not waiting, not wondering, just living. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt, and the holiday sparkle dulled from porches and windows. Life moved forward, or at least, mine did. I kept to my quiet routines. Tea in the morning, a walk around the block, a visit to the library. I smiled at neighbors, joined a small book club, even started writing again. Not letters this time, but poems. Pieces of me I'd buried under years of roles and obligations. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first, but the voice was familiar. My son. Hey, he said, hesitantly. We haven't heard from you in a while. You okay? I paused, letting the silence do what my words no longer needed to. I'm well, I said simply. There was a beat. He expected more. Maybe a catch in my voice. Maybe a gentle scolding like before. You should call more. Or perhaps the same question I always asked. When are you coming to visit? But I didn't ask this time, because I no longer needed to. He cleared his throat. It's just been quiet. I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. You wanted peace, I said softly. I gave it. Another pause. This one heavier. He muttered something vague. Something about being busy, things piling up. I nodded along, polite but distant. I didn't ask about his wife. I didn't ask about my grandchildren. I didn't try to fill the spaces between his words. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. I could hear it in his voice, the way he kept waiting for the old version of me to resurface. The mother who chased, who soothed, who filled silences he never cared to notice before. But that woman no longer lived here. I offered no guilt, no tears, just stillness. Well, okay, he said eventually. Just checking in. Thank you, I replied. Take care. And then we hung up. There was no storm, no revelation, no apology, just a shift. And this time, the silence didn't fall on me. It belonged to them. For the first time, they sat in the absence. And I rested in peace. The real kind. The kind you find when you stop begging to be seen. It started as a simple idea, a way to pass the time. There was a small community shelter 2 blocks from my home. I'd walked past it for years, never really noticing. But one morning, I stepped inside and asked, "Do you need help with anything?" The coordinator looked surprised, then smiled wide. We always need more hands. And so, I began volunteering. At first, I sorted donated clothes and helped serve meals. But before long, I found myself sitting with the residents, listening to their stories over tea and folding chairs. People who had lost more than I ever had, and yet, somehow, still laughed, still hoped, still cared. They asked about my favorite books, my favorite soup. One woman crocheted me a scarf, just because. A man named Jonah always saved me a seat beside him, saying, "You're too kind to be standing." These weren't my children. These weren't my relatives. But somehow, they saw me. We shared stories like old friends. We laughed. The kind of laughter that feels like a warm blanket. No judgment. No performance. Just presence. One afternoon, while helping a young woman named Amina write a job application, she paused, looked at me, and said softly, "I wish you were my mom." The words hit me like sunlight on a cold day. Not because they came from someone who knew my history, but because they came from someone who saw my heart. For once, I didn't feel like a burden. I didn't feel dismissed or bypassed. I didn't feel like someone to be tolerated from a distance. I felt claimed, not out of duty, not out of tradition, but by choice. I went home that evening with sore feet and the kind of joy you can't fake. The kind that rises from the soil of being needed, not for what you can do, but for who you are. I had spent years offering love to people who couldn't see it anymore, but now, I was offering it to people who held it with both hands. And somewhere in the warmth of strangers, I found something my own blood had forgotten to give. Belonging. The fire crackled softly beside me, its glow flickering across the walls of my small, peaceful living room. Outside, the last of the spring chill still clung to the breeze, but inside, it was warm, not just in temperature, but in spirit. I sat with a blanket over my lap, a book half open beside me, and my phone in my hand. Not because I was waiting for a message, just because I was finally ready to revisit one. I scrolled back through old conversations, past birthdays I'd sent messages for and never heard back, past forwarded photos of grandchildren I wasn't invited to hold. And there it was, the message that had changed everything. We just want a peaceful Christmas with the friends. Don't come. I read it slowly, like someone reviewing a sentence they once didn't understand. But now, I did. Completely. I smiled. Not with bitterness. Not with sarcasm. Just with truth. Because now, months later, I knew what that message really was. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a doorway, one they closed, and one I walked away from. Back then, I replied with a single word. Enjoy. At the time, it was all I could manage. But sitting here now, firelight dancing across my journal, I whispered the rest of what I never said. Enjoy the quiet you chose, because silence echoes differently when love walks away. They didn't want tension. They didn't want tradition. They wanted space. And I gave it to them. I gave them exactly what they asked for. Peace. But what they didn't realize is that peace comes with consequence. Because now, I no longer reach out first. I no longer wait by the phone. I no longer carve out time for people who wouldn't share a chair with me at their own table. I found my peace, too, in the laughter of strangers who became friends, in handwritten letters from neighbors who remembered my birthday, in the simple joy of volunteering, of waking up with purpose. They thought removing me from one holiday would change nothing. But it changed everything, because it forced me to ask, who am I without them? And the answer was softer, fuller, more free than I ever expected. I am still love. I am still memory. I am still home, even if they've forgotten the address. They erased me from one holiday, but I rewrote the rest of my life.